Hello, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube keeps showing you more spine-chilling stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My name is David Hartwell, and for 18 years, I worked as a groundskeeper and night caretaker at Whispering Pines Cemetery in Salem, Oregon. Most people just called me the Crypt Keeper during my time there, which I suppose was fitting given how much time I spent among the dead. I've witnessed things in that cemetery that would make most people question their sanity. Strange lights hovering over fresh graves, whispers echoing from empty mausoleums, and shadows moving between headstones when no one was there to cast them. But what I'm about to tell you about happened on a cold November night in 2019, and it's the one experience that made me hand in my keys and walk away from the only job I'd ever truly understood. It involves a particular coffin that arrived at our cemetery under circumstances so unusual that even now, 3 years later, I still check my locks twice before bed and find myself looking over my shoulder in broad daylight. Whispering Pines is one of the oldest cemeteries on the West Coast. Established in 1847 when Salem was barely more than a collection of wooden buildings and dirt roads. The property spans 43 acres of rolling hills dotted with ancient oak trees and weathered headstones that tell the stories of pioneers, soldiers, and families who built this part of Oregon. During my 18 years there, I oversaw the burial of thousands of people and maintained the grounds through every season, every kind of weather, and every type of tragedy you can imagine. As the night caretaker, my responsibilities included securing the cemetery after visiting hours, maintaining the equipment, and ensuring that everything was properly locked and monitored overnight. The position required someone comfortable working alone in a place that most people found unsettling even during daylight hours. I had always been drawn to quiet, solitary work, and there was something peaceful about walking those paths at night, surrounded by the history and stories of generations of families. The cemetery operated with a small staff during the day. Margaret Chen, our office manager, handled the administrative work and family consultations. Frank Morrison, our head groundskeeper, managed the landscaping and grave preparation during regular hours. Dr. Patricia Vance, a retired physician who served as our part-time medical examiner, consulted on unusual cases and ensured that all legal requirements were met for burials and exhumations. And then there was me, holding down the fort from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 6 days a week. Most nights were routine. I would walk the perimeter, check the security systems, perform basic maintenance on equipment, and occasionally deal with teenagers trying to sneak in for late-night adventures or ghost hunting expeditions. The work suited me perfectly. I enjoyed the solitude, the responsibility, and the sense that I was serving families during their most difficult moments by ensuring their loved ones rested in a place that was safe, clean, and respectfully maintained. November 2019 had been unusually busy for us. We had processed more burials that month than in any November during my tenure, including several that required special accommodations due to the circumstances surrounding the deaths. On November 23rd, Margaret informed me that we would be receiving a particularly unusual case the following evening. The deceased was a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, age 34, who had died under what the coroner's office described as unexplained circumstances. She had been found in her apartment in downtown Portland by her landlord after neighbors reported a strange smell and unusual sounds coming from her unit. When police entered the apartment, they discovered Eleanor's body in what appeared to be perfect condition, with no obvious signs of trauma, illness, or cause of death. What made the case even more puzzling was that Eleanor had been dead for an estimated 2 weeks, yet her body showed no signs of decomposition. The temperature in her apartment had been normal. There were no preservative chemicals present. and the medical examiner could find no explanation for the remarkable preservation of her remains. After extensive testing and investigation, the official cause of death was listed as undetermined, and her body was released for burial. Eleanor had no known family, no emergency contacts, and very few personal possessions. Her burial was being arranged and paid for by a law firm in Portland that claimed to be handling her estate, though they provided minimal information about their client or the source of the funding for her funeral arrangements. The law firm specifically requested burial at Whispering Pines and insisted that Eleanor be interred in our oldest section, among graves dating back to the 1800s. Margaret showed me the paperwork and burial instructions, which were more detailed and specific than anything I had seen in 18 years of cemetery work. The law firm required that Eleanor be buried in a particular style of coffin, made from a specific type of wood, with custom interior materials that they would provide. They insisted that the burial take place at night, with minimal lighting, and that no religious services or ceremonies be performed. Most unusually, they requested that the grave remain unmarked for at least 30 days after burial. These requirements struck me as odd, but they weren't technically unusual enough to raise legal concerns. Families occasionally had specific cultural or personal requests for burial arrangements, and as long as all health and safety regulations were met, we accommodated their wishes. The law firm was paying well above our standard rates and had provided all necessary documentation, so Margaret approved the arrangements. On the evening of November 24th, I arrived for my shift to find that Eleanor's coffin had already been delivered and was waiting in our preparation building. Frank had informed me that the delivery had taken place around 4 in the afternoon, just as he was finishing his daily rounds. The delivery truck was unmarked, and the driver had refused to provide any information beyond confirming the delivery address and obtaining Frank's signature. I decided to inspect the coffin before the burial crew arrived later that evening. The preparation building was a modest structure near the center of the cemetery, where we stored equipment and prepared graves for services. As I approached the building, I noticed that the temperature seemed to drop significantly, even though the November evening was relatively mild for Oregon. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the first thing that struck me was the complete silence. Normally, the building had the usual sounds of settling wood, the hum of electrical equipment, and the distant noise of traffic from the road that ran along the cemetery's eastern border. But that night, stepping into the preparation building was like entering a soundproof chamber where even my own footsteps seemed muffled and distant. The coffin sat in the center of the room, and I immediately understood why the law firm had been so specific about their requirements. This was not a standard burial casket. The wood appeared to be some kind of dark hardwood that I couldn't identify, almost black in color with grain patterns that seemed to shift and move in the overhead lighting. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, with intricate carvings along the sides and lid that depicted scenes I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. As I moved closer to examine the coffin, I became aware of a subtle but persistent sound that seemed to be coming from inside. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing, but so faint that I had to strain to hear it. I told myself it was probably the wood settling, or some kind of acoustic effect from the building's ventilation system, but the sound continued with such regularity that it was difficult to dismiss. The lid of the coffin was secured with an unusual locking mechanism that I had never seen before. Instead of standard latches or screws, there were 7 ornate metal clasps arranged in a specific pattern across the lid. Each clasp was engraved with symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar, and they appeared to be made from a metal that was darker than brass but lighter than iron. The clasps were warm to the touch, which struck me as impossible given that the coffin had been sitting in an unheated building for several hours on a cold November evening. When I ran my fingers along the metal, I could feel a subtle vibration, as if some kind of energy was pulsing through the material. The sensation made my skin crawl, but I convinced myself it was probably just my imagination combined with the unusual circumstances surrounding this burial. What troubled me most was the weight of the coffin. I had moved hundreds of caskets during my years at Whispering Pines, and I could usually estimate the approximate weight based on the size and construction materials. This coffin appeared to be standard dimensions, but when I attempted to shift it slightly to check the positioning, it felt impossibly heavy. Not just heavy for its size, but heavy in a way that seemed to defy physics, as if the contents were denser than any human body should be. The burial crew arrived at 10:30 that evening, consisting of Jake Martinez and Tom Bradley, two men I had worked with dozens of times over the years. Both were experienced professionals who approached their work with appropriate solemnity and efficiency, but as soon as they entered the preparation building, I could see their discomfort. Jake stopped just inside the doorway and looked around with obvious confusion. "Doc, is there something wrong with the ventilation in here? It feels like the air is thick, almost hard to breathe." Tom nodded in agreement, pulling at his collar as if trying to get more air. "I've never noticed anything like this before. Should we open some windows?" I hadn't noticed any air quality issues myself, but I opened the side windows to accommodate their concerns. The November night air flowed into the building, but it didn't seem to alleviate whatever was bothering Jake and Tom. If anything, their discomfort appeared to increase as we prepared to move the coffin. When we attempted to lift Eleanor's coffin using our standard equipment, we immediately encountered problems. The hydraulic dolly that we used for transporting caskets struggled to support the weight, making grinding sounds that I had never heard before. The wheels, which were designed to roll smoothly across various surfaces, seemed to stick and catch as if they were moving through thick mud rather than across the concrete floor. Jake and Tom exchanged worried glances as we maneuvered the coffin toward the door. "Dave, this doesn't feel right," Jake said, his voice tight with strain. "I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I've never encountered a casket that moved like this. It's like it doesn't want to be moved." Tom was sweating despite the cool evening air, and his hands were shaking slightly as he guided the dolly. "The weight distribution is all wrong," he said. "It feels like whatever's inside is shifting around, but that's impossible given the circumstances." As we made our way across the cemetery grounds toward the designated burial site, the problems intensified. The dolly wheels continued to stick and catch, requiring significantly more effort than usual to maintain forward momentum. The overhead pathway lights, which were motion-activated and normally provided adequate illumination for nighttime work, seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows that appeared to move independently of our progress. Most disturbing was the sound coming from inside the coffin, which had grown more pronounced during transport. What had been a barely audible rhythmic noise in the preparation building had become something that all three of us could hear clearly. It sounded like tapping, as if someone inside was gently knocking on the lid from within. Jake stopped pushing the dolly and stepped back. "I'm not imagining that, right? You guys hear it too?" Tom and I both nodded, though none of us wanted to acknowledge what we were hearing. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the movement of the dolly was causing some internal component of the coffin to shift and create the tapping sound. But the rhythm was too regular, too purposeful to be explained by random mechanical movement. The burial site was located in the oldest section of Whispering Pines, among graves dating back to the 1850s. The area was characterized by weathered headstones, gnarled oak trees, and an atmosphere of deep historical significance. During daylight hours, it was one of the most peaceful and beautiful sections of the cemetery. But that night, as we approached Eleanor's prepared grave, the entire area felt oppressive and unwelcoming. The grave had been dug earlier that day by Frank and his crew, following the specific dimensions provided by the law firm. It was deeper than our standard burial depth, extending nearly 8 feet into the ground rather than the typical 6 feet. The law firm had insisted on this depth and had paid additional fees to accommodate the extra excavation work. As we positioned the coffin over the grave using our mechanical lowering system, several things happened that I still struggled to explain rationally. First, the temperature in the immediate area dropped so dramatically that our breath became visible in the air. Second, the tapping sound from inside the coffin increased in frequency and intensity, becoming so loud that it echoed off the surrounding headstones. Third, every battery-powered device we were carrying, flashlights, radios, and cell phones, began to malfunction simultaneously. Jake's flashlight flickered and died completely, leaving us with only the dim illumination from the nearby pathway lights. Tom's radio, which he used to communicate with our dispatch service, emitted a high-pitched whining sound before going silent. My own cell phone, which had been fully charged when I arrived for my shift, showed a completely dead battery despite having been used only briefly during the evening. The mechanical lowering system, which operated on a combination of hydraulic pressure and electric motors, began to behave erratically as we attempted to lower Eleanor's coffin into the grave. The motors made grinding, labored sounds, and the descent was jerky and uneven rather than the smooth, controlled lowering that we had performed hundreds of times before. Halfway through the lowering process, the system stopped completely. The coffin hung suspended over the grave, swaying slightly in what should have been still air. Jake tried to restart the machinery, but nothing happened. The hydraulic pressure gauges showed normal readings, the electrical connections appeared secure, and there was no obvious mechanical failure that would explain the malfunction. "We're going to have to lower it manually," Tom said, though his voice betrayed his reluctance to touch the coffin any more than necessary. The manual backup system required us to release the hydraulic pressure and use a hand crank mechanism to control the descent. It was more labor-intensive and time-consuming, but it was a reliable backup that had never failed us before. As soon as Jake engaged the manual release, the coffin dropped several inches unexpectedly, causing all of us to jump back from the gravesite. The sudden movement was accompanied by a loud banging sound from inside the coffin. Not the rhythmic tapping we had been hearing, but a sharp, forceful impact, as if someone inside had been thrown against the lid. The three of us stood in stunned silence, staring at the coffin as it swayed in the mechanical harness. The tapping had stopped completely, replaced by an absolute quiet that felt even more unnerving than the sounds we had been hearing. The air around the grave seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe, and I could feel a pressure in my ears as if we were at a much higher altitude. "Dave, I think we need to call this off," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something is seriously wrong here. This isn't normal, and I don't think we should continue with this burial." Tom nodded in agreement, backing away from the gravesite. I've never experienced anything like this in 20 years of cemetery work. Every instinct I have is telling me to walk away from this situation right now. I understood their concerns completely, but we were in an impossible situation. We had a legal obligation to complete the burial. The family's law firm had paid substantial fees, and abandoning a coffin suspended over an open grave would create complications that could cost me my job and potentially result in legal action against the cemetery. Despite every instinct telling me to walk away, I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "We're going to finish this burial," I told them, trying to project more confidence than I felt. There has to be a rational explanation for what we're experiencing. Equipment malfunctions happen. Temperature fluctuations are common in November, and old buildings can create unusual acoustic effects. Jake and Tom looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but they were professional enough to follow my lead. We resumed the manual lowering process, taking turns with the hand crank while the others guided the coffin's descent. Every few inches we would pause to ensure the coffin remained level and stable, but each pause seemed to intensify whatever was happening around us. As Eleanor's coffin descended deeper into the grave, the oppressive atmosphere grew stronger. The air became so thick that we found ourselves breathing heavily, despite the minimal physical exertion required for the manual lowering. The silence was absolute except for the mechanical sounds of the cranking system, but that silence felt alive somehow, as if it were actively suppressing other sounds that wanted to emerge. When the coffin finally reached the bottom of the grave, 8 feet below ground level, something changed dramatically in the entire cemetery. The oppressive feeling that had been building throughout the evening suddenly intensified to an almost unbearable level. I felt dizzy and disoriented, as if the ground beneath my feet was shifting and unstable. Jake collapsed to his knees beside the grave, clutching his chest and gasping for air. "Doc, something's wrong," he wheezed. "I can't breathe properly and my chest feels like there's a weight pressing down on it." Tom was backing away from the gravesite, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "The headstones, Dave. Look at the headstones around us." I followed his gaze and saw something that defied rational explanation. The weathered granite and marble headstones in the immediate area appeared to be changing color, becoming darker and more shadowed despite the consistent lighting from the pathway lamps. More disturbing was that the carved text on several monuments seemed to be shifting and rearranging itself, as if the letters were moving independently across the stone surfaces. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes, convinced that stress and fatigue were causing visual hallucinations. But when I looked again, the phenomenon continued. Names, dates, and epitaphs that I had read hundreds of times during my years at Whispering Pines were transforming into words and symbols that I couldn't understand. "We need to get out of here right now," Tom said, his voice rising with panic. "This isn't natural, Dave. Something is seriously wrong with this entire situation." But we couldn't leave yet. We still needed to disconnect the lowering equipment, fill in the grave, and complete the burial process. Abandoning the job at this point would leave Eleanor's coffin exposed and create a dangerous situation for anyone who might visit the cemetery before we could return to finish the work. "Help me disconnect the harness," I told them, trying to maintain some semblance of normal procedure. "Once we get the equipment cleared, we can fill the grave and get out of here." Jake struggled to his feet, still breathing heavily, and together we worked to release the mechanical harness from the coffin. As soon as the metal cables were disconnected and pulled clear of the grave, we heard a sound that made all 3 of us freeze in terror. It was Eleanor's voice, muffled but unmistakably human, coming from inside the coffin 8 feet below ground. "Thank you," she said clearly. "Thank you for bringing me home." The 3 of us stared at each other in absolute shock. There was no possible way that Eleanor Blackwood was alive inside that coffin. She had been examined by medical professionals, declared legally dead, and had been in the custody of the coroner's office for over a week. The voice we heard couldn't be coming from someone who was still alive. Jake started running toward the cemetery entrance without another word. Tom followed immediately, abandoning the equipment and leaving me alone beside Eleanor's grave. I should have run with them, but something compelled me to stay. Perhaps it was 18 years of professional responsibility, or maybe it was a morbid curiosity about what was happening, but I couldn't force myself to abandon the burial site. "Eleanor," I called down into the grave, feeling foolish but needing to know if I would get a response. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute, and I began to think that I had imagined the voice. Then, from the depths of the grave, came a sound that was unmistakably laughter. Not the desperate, panicked laughter of someone who had been mistakenly buried alive, but something cold and knowing and utterly inhuman. "I have been waiting so long for someone to understand." Eleanor's voice drifted up from the coffin. You're different from the others, David. You're not afraid in the same way. You want to know the truth about what I am. Every rational thought in my mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that grave as possible and never look back. But Eleanor was right about one thing. I did want to understand what was happening. In 18 years of cemetery work, I had never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of life and death so completely. "What are you?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I am what remains when someone dies in a way that the universe doesn't recognize as final," Eleanor replied. "I'm consciousness that refused to depart when my body stopped functioning. I'm the part of a human being that can exist independently of flesh and blood and bone." The temperature around the grave dropped even further, and I could see my breath forming thick clouds in the air. The pathway lights flickered erratically, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance independently around the headstones. "The law firm that arranged my burial," Eleanor continued, "they understand what I am. They've been collecting people like me for decades, bringing us to places like this cemetery where we can rest among others who died in more conventional ways. But rest is not what I seek, David. What do you want?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that I didn't want to know the answer. "I want to walk among the living again," she said, and her voice was getting stronger, as if she were somehow moving closer to the surface despite being trapped inside a locked coffin 8 feet underground. "I want to feel sunlight and rain and wind. I want to taste food and water and breathe fresh air. I want to touch other people and have them touch me in return." The implications of what Eleanor was describing filled me with a terror deeper than anything I had ever experienced. If she was some kind of consciousness that could exist independently of her physical body, then the normal boundaries between life and death didn't apply to her situation. And if she wanted to walk among the living again, then she needed a way to escape from her burial site. "You can help me, David," Eleanor said, as if she were reading my thoughts. "You understand this cemetery better than anyone. You know how to move between the world of the living and the world of the dead. You can be my guide back to the life I want to reclaim." I started backing away from the grave, finally allowing fear to override curiosity. Whatever Eleanor was, whatever had happened to her during her death, I knew that helping her was not something I could or should do. There were reasons that the dead remained buried, reasons that certain boundaries existed between life and death. "Don't leave me here, David," Eleanor called after me, and now her voice carried a note of desperation that made it sound more human and somehow more frightening. "You're the only person who has listened to me, the only one who hasn't run away. I need your help to complete what I started when I died." I broke into a run, abandoning all the equipment beside Eleanor's grave and heading for my truck in the cemetery's maintenance area. Behind me, I could hear Eleanor's voice growing louder and more insistent, calling my name and pleading with me to return. But there was something else mixed in with her words now, something that sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, as if other entities were joining her calls. As I reached my truck and fumbled with the keys, I looked back toward Eleanor's burial site and saw something that convinced me I was making the right decision by leaving. The area around her grave was glowing with a faint, sickly light that seemed to emanate from underground. The light pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, and with each pulse I could see shadows moving between the headstones in ways that suggested they weren't being cast by any visible objects. I drove home that night and called in sick for the next 3 days, unable to face returning to Whispering Pines. When I finally went back to work, I learned that Frank had completed Eleanor's burial using a crew from a different cemetery, and that Jake and Tom had both submitted their resignations effective immediately. Margaret told me that the law firm had called to confirm that the burial had been completed satisfactorily. but they had refused to provide any additional information about their client or the unusual circumstances. I tried to convince myself that Eleanor's burial was an isolated incident, but over the following months I began experiencing things that made it impossible to continue working at Whispering Pines. I would hear my name being called from empty sections of the cemetery during my night rounds. Equipment would malfunction near Eleanor's gravesite, which remained unmarked as the law firm had requested. Most disturbing of all, I started seeing a figure in dark clothing walking among the headstones in the oldest section, always just at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I tried to get a closer look. 3 months after Eleanor's burial, I submitted my resignation and moved to a different state. I work in landscape maintenance now, strictly during daylight hours, and I avoid any job sites that might involve cemeteries or burial grounds. But even now, living hundreds of miles away from Whispering Pines, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night hearing Eleanor's voice calling my name, thanking me for bringing her.